Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Alexis Badenmare. I'm the political director of the Organic Consumers Association. And today I am joined by Jeffrey Smith of the Institute for Responsible Technology. Welcome, Jeffrey.
Thank you very much, Alexis.
It is so great to be with you. I was just behind the scenes before we went live, gushing over this opportunity to be face-to-face with you virtually, if not in person. It's been a long time. When I first started at Organic Consumers Association back in 2005, I immediately became aware of your amazing work at the Institute for Responsible Technology. You had collected and probably still have like every piece of scientific information on the health impacts of GMOs. I don't think that there's anyone in the world who probably has the brain trust that you all have at your organization, and you specifically. And then from there, you went on to create incredible movies that were literally movement building movies. I don't think that we would have had the ballot initiatives to label GMOs, the national anti-GMO movement, if it weren't for your film Genetic Roulette and then Secret Ingredients. Such important films. And more recently, you've gone on to create Protect Nature Now. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. It's been a while since you and I have been in touch, so we've got a lot to catch up on. So, you know, if anyone who's listening hasn't, please go to protectnaturenow.org and watch the film.
.com.
.com, protectnaturenow.com, and watch the film that is on the webpage right there, because that'll give you the whole story. And everything Jeffrey and I are going to talk about today is about that. So if you aren't familiar, pause us, go to protectnaturenow.com, watch the film that's there, and then come back and talk about it with us. The film is how many minutes, right?
It's 16 minutes.
It's just 16 minutes. So you can even go, if you're live with us at this moment, you can go take 16 minutes, catch up with us live, give us your comments and questions, join the conversation 16 minutes from now. So Jeffrey, this Protect Nature Now movie, it really, well, I have to admit, honestly, even though I've been in the GMO movement, I've been well educated by you for a long time, I didn't understand this idea that we had to protect nature from GMOs. But you demonstrate in your film that these little microbes are far more dangerous than most people can imagine. And you outline an incident that happened where a microbe was used in agriculture, and it could have had devastating effects on our food supply. And, you know, if we're talking about devastating the food supply, which is an ecosystem, it could have devastated any ecosystem. Take us from that moment in this history forward.
Sure. My source for this is Dr. Elaine Ingham, who was at Oregon State University and was a professor and had a graduate student that she was advising who wanted to get his PhD. And he wanted to do some research on GMOs, GMO microbes, and was looking for an opportunity to find a microbe that survived outdoors in the soil. And there was one that was actually a perfect candidate. In fact, the idea by the scientists that developed this on paper seemed to be glorious, that they would take a natural occurring microbe that exists everywhere on the planet in the root structure and the soil by the roots, and change it in such a way that, because it can stay in the soil, it survives. We know that it survives, but the genetically engineered version would instead decompose plant matter and turn it into alcohol. And the reason why they wanted to do this was that it was going to solve a problem, an ecological problem. Farmers were harvesting their goods, their materials, their foods, and then they had this plant matter just sitting on their fields. So what they'd often do is burn it, which is not good for the atmosphere, not good for carbon release, not good for breathing. They said, wait a minute, take this material and put it in a big barrel with this genetically engineered bacteria. And then in a couple of weeks, open the spigot at the bottom, and voila, you will now have alcohol. Reconfigure your tractors to run on alcohol, sell alcohol off farm to others, turn your crop stubble into a revenue generator. But it doesn't stop there. At the bottom of the barrel, there's going to be some sludge. It's going to be filled with the nutrients because the alcohol comes up, all the nutrients are going to be in there. Perfect fertilizer. So you're using your own crop stubble to fertilize the next season. And this was planned to be released to US farmers all over the country. They had submitted their microbe to the EPA, and it was tested for all of these things that the EPA requires. It passed with flying colors. And they were planning to release this bacterium outdoors to see how far it would spread on its own. And they had a date by which they were going to release this piece. Now, I'm going to change the order as it is in the film. The film is called Don't Let the Gene Out of the Bottle. It's at protectnaturenow.com. And here's an example why. After what I'm about to tell you, there was a big controversy, and Professor Elaine Ingham spoke at the United Nations, and there was headlines all over the world about a near cataclysm. And some people from the EPA contacted her and said, we've been doing a secret experiment that the EPA still has not acknowledged to this day, where they genetically engineered bacteria to fix nitrogen and released it in a field in Louisiana. And they set up monitoring centers around to see how far it would spread. This was what the people with this alcohol-producing bacterium were going to do. They had already done it at the EPA and found in the first season it went 11 miles, and the next season 11 more. And eventually, and at a certain point, pretty early on, the EPA said, okay, we got the idea, it spreads. We're not going to do any more monitoring. So they pulled the plug. But some EPA employees decided to continue the monitoring, finding that it was traveling and traveling and traveling. And within a few years, I don't know how many, there was no place on Earth where they couldn't find it. It went everywhere on the planet. So we know that microbes travel. We didn't need the EPA secret study to tell us. Look what happened in the last few years with the pandemic, where a virus traveled, infected, multiplied, traveled, mutated, etc. They do that, viruses, bacteria, etc. So what was about to happen was this organization was going to release this microbe called Klebsiella planticola outdoors to see how far it would spread. But 2 weeks before, the graduate student came into the lab some Saturday morning and looked, and he had been growing wheat plants on soil that had either been mixed with regular Klebsiella planticola that wasn't genetically engineered, with no Klebsiella planticola, or with the GMO alcohol creating version. And he found that a bunch of his wheat plants, which had grown a little, had been destroyed. They were basically slime on the surface of the soil. And he freaked out, and he called Dr. Ingham, and he thought that he had made a terrible mistake, and he was all sorts of, she's calm down, sort which trays have the dead ones, see where it turns out the only dead ones were the ones where the soil had been mixed with the genetically engineered bacteria. It was still functioning, and it turned the roots and then the plants into alcohol. So the slime that was on the surface was just a combination of the bacteria doing what it was designed to do in a lab and these natural wheat seeds. So as you'll see in the film, I asked Dr. Ingham what would have happened if they had done that experiment 2 weeks later. And
Mm.
the answer is it kind of depends. It's like, imagine for a moment that the genetically engineered version survives in the presence of alcohol, which apparently it does, but the natural version dies in the presence of alcohol.
Hmm.
Imagine that the genetically engineered version starts to spread, and because it is Klebsiella planticola frankenfood or whatever, because it's a
Okay.
Frankenstein version of it, it
Mhm.
still may fit comfortably in the ecosystem at the roots of all plants in the planet, and it
Mhm.
might occupy that, and it might even kill off its natural counterpart and take up residence there because it's producing alcohol, but then it might kill the roots of
Mm.
whatever it's populating around
Right.
and destroy the terrestrial plants because it will continue to spread through the soil, spread through the air, and then destroy the root structures anywhere it takes hold.
Hmm.
So I asked Dr. Ingham, what's the natural consequence of this spreading around the world? And she said, it could end terrestrial plant life. Now, that is not a catastrophe, it is a cataclysm.
Mm.
It is a existential event. And she, at one point, it's not in the film, she goes, oh, it wouldn't damage the marine. You could still grow agriculture in oceans. And I'm like, oh, good, oh, good. Soylent Green, it becomes kelp green. So
Oh, man.
now, between the experiment by this graduate student and saying that it could destroy all terrestrial plant life, there's a lot of ifs there. But we
Mhm.
don't really want to release it to find out.
No.
And this was one of two genetically engineered bacterium that were almost released that could have had a cataclysmic effect discussed in the film.
Jeez. Wow. Well, jeez. So this, my mind's been turning, all the wheels been turning. And so the first thing that this story reminds me of is the fact that I believe it was Syngenta got approved during the Obama administration a corn that was designed to more rapidly process itself into ethanol. Do you recall this?
It was actually a starch. It was something that was going to be used for ethanol, and it produced this starch.
Yeah.
And the starch wasn't necessarily safe for humans.
Right.
Um, and somehow, these major corporations that produce seeds for farmers have no clue about agriculture. It's like, I mean, there's farmers, I think, in Illinois at one point that were complaining that there were little kernels of blue corn in their yellow cornfields.
Okay.
There were no blue cornfields around, but they were 2 or 3 miles away. So what happened?
Hmm.
Pollen from corn, it normally is viable for 1 to 2 hours. It's theoretically viable up to 24. So it gets picked up in the wind and it lands. Now, you know those tassels when you shuck corn, there's all
Right.
those fibers.
Mhm.
There's one per kernel, and that's how it gets fertilized. I
Huh,
think
one per kernel.
pollinized.
Wow, I
So
never knew that. Okay.
that way, you can have some of the kernels in the corn
Mhm.
being pollinized by the blue corn pollen that flew in the wind. And so in the middle of this
Huh.
cob, you have these invaders.
Right.
So now imagine that you plant genetically engineered corn that's the
Mhm.
same color. You don't know that you're eating corn on the cob, which has a few of the kernels that are genetically engineered.
Mm.
Now, let's say you're planting it for seed corn. So you shuck the seeds, you plant them. Some of those seeds are pure genetic engineered. Now they're growing
Right.
plants with lots of other seeds, and then they grow. So that's just one way, one of the many ways that contamination happens.
Yeah, I
And
remember the corn millers, like the people who make high fructose corn syrup, not, organic type people. They
not the
were
people
up
that
in
generally,
arms.
not the people that march with you.
Right, yeah. They didn't want the ethanol corn to get out because they were concerned that it would impact their ability to make products like high fructose corn syrup or tortilla chips, I guess. But yeah, so these things are really dangerous, can spread very quickly, and can change the world as we know it. The other thing that your story and the subject of protectnaturenow.com's film calls to mind, I've been looking at Bayer's Leap. Have you checked that out?
Uh,
Monsanto merged with Bayer, and now Bayer has a program called Leaps by Bayer. And it's a project they're doing along with the World Economic Forum. And they talk about all the neat things that they could do with genetic engineering. And one of the big topics is, of course, they can solve climate change with genetic engineering.
oh,
And
of course.
and the way, yes, clearly. I mean, it was meant to do that, right? And it wasn't meant for corporate profits or to sell pesticides. It was always
No,
all about saving the planet.
it's the flavor of the month. It's like, okay, we have food shortage, we'll come in with GMOs. We have
That's right.
famine, GMOs will help. We have overpopulation. Oh, we won't talk about that one. We have, you know, it's like anything that comes up, they'll spin it and say, our technology is the solution.
Right.
And I mean, for example, and I'll just do a little quick tangent and come back to you. Remember where you
Yeah.
are with Lee.
Yeah.
Um, when Europe rejected GMOs early on in the late 90s, the PR company for Monsanto decided to create full page ads saying it's going to feed the world. So they wanted to convince the developed countries that they needed to accept a technology that was highly risky for health and the environment because
Mhm.
eventually it would be used to feed and solve the problems of world hunger.
Hmm.
Well, there was a meeting at the same time among representatives of 24 African states, and they wrote back saying, don't use us as an excuse to sell your dangerous product. And that was published. But this feed the world mantra was going and going and going. And in 2008, the UN had convened the most comprehensive evaluation of how actually to feed the world. They brought
Right.
the world's best scientists together and
Mhm.
they created the ISTAD report,
Right.
3,500 pages, signed on by 59 countries. And they rejected GMOs as even having anything to do with meeting their goals of feeding the world, creating sustainable agriculture, or eradicating poverty. And I interviewed Hans Herren, the co-chairman, and he dismissed GMOs. I interviewed Jack Heinemann and all these chief writers that wrote for whole continents
Mhm.
at one of their meetings, and I have it on video. And it's like every one of them said this has nothing to do with feeding the world, and yet at the whole years before and years after, it's supposedly we need GMOs to feed the world, and now it's climate change, and soon it'll be we need it to help regenerative agriculture. I mean, like they're trying to take over everything. And as the film points out, here's where we get back to the film. Don't forget
Yeah.
Luke. Okay. So the microbiome. I mean, if you've been awake in the last 5 years, you've probably heard the term. It's microbial communities. It's basically an understanding that the bacteria, viruses, fungi, algae, all these have a fundamental role in human and environmental health.
Mhm.
80% of our diseases start with an imbalance in the microbiome. If you
Right.
do what's literally a fecal transplant from
Yeah.
one human to another, you can pass along health or disease because
Right.
there's some kind of not well understood programming in the genetic makeup and in the actual makeup of these microbes. But we actually outsource up to 90% of our metabolic and chemical functions to the microbiome living inside us, which is
Mm.
why we can get away with a measly 22,000 genes, less than earthworms, because we're utilizing the genetic information of the
Huh.
3.5 million genes in the microbiome living inside us. It is
Wow.
such an elegant, massively orchestrated, complex system that when the microbiome is properly established in an infant, it sets up proper health for the rest of their life and for
Yeah.
future generations potentially. So
Yeah.
in order to make that happen, milk digesting microbes migrate into the birth canal in the second trimester. They
Mm.
inoculate the baby during the birth process.
Mm.
Additional microbes are produced in the milk and available on the nipple of the breastfeeding child. A significant portion of the milk is undigestible by the baby. It's not designed for the baby. It feeds the microbes to make sure they're healthy. The microbes in the saliva of the baby reflect the health of the baby. They feed back through the nipple to the mother, which can change the formula. It is this elegant, mind
Wow.
blowing, orchestrated event so that the community, which we have co evolved with for millennia and millennia, actually is well established because we're not individuals, we're communities. We
Yeah.
have far more bacteria than we have cells in our body, let
Mm.
alone viruses, etc. So when the gut microbiome wants to be fed in a certain way, wants certain experiences, it can cause us to want to be social. It can, if we're doing things
Huh.
that it likes, it can generate the reward center in the brain. It
Hmm.
can make us want to eat cupcakes, etc. There's a way,
True.
our emotions and all that are part of this community that we foster.
Yeah.
Now, consider the nature of microbes. We talked a moment ago about how microbes can travel the world
Mhm.
and mutate. Most
Mhm.
people don't know how bacteria have sex. They exchange genes. So
Oh.
imagine you create a genetically engineered microbe, you release it, it becomes quadrillions in a few hours or whatever. And now it takes off. It takes airplanes because it's on the bottom of your feet. It takes boats,
Mm.
flies in the air. It gets moved by birds and etc. So now it's going all over the place and it's infecting and replicating and it's already mutating. So you've
Mhm.
genetically engineered it. It's now operating in ecosystems that you never planned for.
Right.
It's mutating and doing things that you never expected. And now it's swapping genes that end up in breast milk. It's
Mm.
swapping genes that end up in our gut bacteria. It's swapping genes that end up in the atmosphere, into microbes that end there, in microbes that already function there and have co-evolved and worked like a hand in glove. But now there's something different. There's a genetic combination that no one has seen before on the planet. And where did it come from? Maybe a high school science class that's now
Hmm.
using CRISPR, where
Mm.
they pick combinations of genes from mail order and they pick combinations of bacteria or other microbes from mail order and they put them together and then they flush them down the toilet and it ends up as an environmental release or it gets on the hands and it gets in the mouth because they're eating. And now you have high school classes all over the United States and Europe. In a few years, they'll all have CRISPR. You have
Mm.
home hobbyists with CRISPR kits. You have all these companies with CRISPR kits and plans. And now you're creating in the next generation 1 million new genetically engineered microbes, some of which are highly viable, travel, mutate, swap genes, and you're taking the microbiome, the kingdoms that support life, the kingdoms that are essential for soil, human health, rainforests, everything, and you're making changes that you cannot unchange.
Yeah.
There's no way to predict what it'll do because we only have characterized less than 1% of all microbes on the planet, let alone what they're good for. But we're changing them irreversibly with combinations that could not possibly occur in nature. And we're doing it in a huge way soon.
Mm.
We're doing it in a way that could be an existential threat. And we
Mm.
only have to look back to this release of this Klebsiella planticola to find out that one bad actor can take us down. What if 1 million are released? They may not take us down in a cataclysm, but they may create a disease or they may eliminate soil microbes' ability to sequester carbon,
Yep.
thereby destroying the ability to draw down carbon into the soil, which are the big plans these days, or eliminating the ability for mothers to breastfeed. All these things are possible none of them are predictable, and we're
Right.
using gene editing, which is a technique which is prone to side effects in the first place.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, so I was going to bring up the Bears leaps by Bear.
Thank
Bears
you.
so Bears basically started like a venture capital wing of its corporation,
Yep.
and they're funding a bunch of different projects, and it's all under these 10 leaps, and one of course is to save the planet from climate change. And it seems like they're just replicating this crazy old experiment that nearly sunk us before, because because regenerative agriculture is so cool, and because we know so much now about human gut microbiology and soil microbiology, they're like, oh great, everybody loves gut microbes. Let's make some of our own. Everybody loves soil microbes. Let's make some of our own. We'll say that we're going to make, only Bayer can make soil microbes that sequester carbon. I mean, it's just like you were describing the miracle of life in the human body from birth because of our microbiology. Obviously, soil microbiology is that amazing, and it's part of the reason why we have this carbon cycle where carbon is drawn out of the atmosphere by plants and sequestered in the soil by the soil microbiology. Bear thinks that they can do it better than nature. And of course they like the one size fits all solutions. It's really interesting to me that once they figured out how to make plants resistant to pesticides, or to make plants produce their own insecticides, they were like, okay, we've got it. And actually, the plants that produce insecticides didn't become the blockbuster products that the plants that produced herbicides did, because they made money off of the plants that produced herbicides. That was
They
genius.
tolerated herbicides. They tolerated herbicides.
Oh
They
yeah,
didn't-
sorry,
they-
sorry. That soaked up the herbicides. Yeah.
Exactly.
So yeah, so you produce, instead of producing a product, you produce a need. You produce this dependency and this endless hunger that has to be satisfied by a product that only the corporation can sell to you. And so if they try to reproduce soil microbiology that sequesters carbon or fixes nitrogen, which already happens naturally, we already have plants that fix nitrogen. You just need a diverse ecosystem within your fields, which is easy to do. Farmers, this is how farming worked before it became simplified by the corporations for profit. Farmers had complex rotations. They had many crops growing at once. And of course, there are amazing farmers that do this today, that are growing tons of cover crops, even as they're producing their crop for sale. So yeah, the idea that they can do it better is nonsense. But I think the thing that most people miss is what your film at protectnaturenow.com explains, is that it's not just hubris, it's not just greed, it's just plain dangerous. And if like it really shouldn't be allowed. It should not be allowed. If we depend on our microbiology of our bodies to survive, and we depend on the microbiology of the soil to have food and life on this planet, it shouldn't be allowed that the corporations like Bayer can start tinkering with this and saying, we think we've got a better probiotic. We think we've got a better soil microbe that can do something that will be highly marketable and make us rich. It just should be illegal. Like what's your view on that? I mean, we're so far from that, so maybe it's not even worth saying, but
Well, I think you're right. I think that, but it's interesting that if we focus on the microbiome and microbes, there's already a lot of deep receptivity built in because of the pandemic, that microbes can wreak havoc and travel and mutate.
Mhm.
And there, even though Bayer has a joint venture with Join Bio, which is their leap version of, they have a nitrogen fixing microbe,
Mm.
that there hasn't been billions of dollars invested into genetically engineered microbe production for outdoor release at this time.
Okay.
So if we try to say, okay, eliminate all GMOs, we run into some problems there. because it's like, okay, uproot the millions, the hundreds of millions of acres. But if we say you have a problem with microbes because you can't control them, you don't know what they're going to do. They're going to be part of the milieu, the microbiome background, potentially everywhere on the planet. EPA knew that, but didn't talk about it.
Yeah.
We know it from the pandemic. And I want to see some jurisdictions make it illegal
Yes.
for manipulated microbes to enter their space
Yeah,
with
that's such a good idea.
teeth, with teeth. And I'd like to see international treaties realize that the cross-border movement is completely impossible. I mean, so much energy and attention is focused on invasive species. You have the agriculture border controls, right?
Yeah.
But if you think about genetically engineered microbes, they're like the worst possible invasive species. You don't even know how they operate in their natural habitat because they've never been in a natural habitat.
Yeah.
And that's something you can't track, you can't recover from. But nonetheless, invasive species do have a good role in terms of the lessons. And one lesson I like to talk about is, at least some lore says it was Christmas Day, others say it was October, but it was in 1859. It was in Victoria, Australia, where a man released 24 rabbits into the countryside so that visitors to Australia from the UK could feel at home because they could go out and shoot some rabbits. Rabbits multiply like rabbits. And by the 1920s, there was an estimated over 10 billion rabbits in Australia because they don't have their natural predators were either gone or very few. And it completely changed the countryside. It completely damaged. I mean, that movie Rabbit Proof Fence? They don't tell you. They built a fence from the north to south, trying to protect the country from half the country from these rabbits. At one point, they killed almost all of them with a virus, but it was like 99 point some percent. But the few that survived became, multiplied like rabbits again and repopulated. So that's an example of, should we allow that person to release 24 rabbits so that people from England felt more comfortable? The answer is a resounding no.
Yeah.
It's absolutely not. It's the commons that they are destroying out of ignorance. Now we think, okay, well, what could go wrong if we genetically engineer the microbe? Everything.
Yeah.
It's not an ecosystem. I mean, in the same film at protectnaturenow.com, there was a microbe bacteria called Pseudomonas syringii. It normally takes moisture and creates frost, snow, ice. It can refrigerate water molecules, refrigerate molecules at lower temperatures. And it's used right now in ski snow making machines. It's used to seed the atmosphere. And what happened is they found that this Pseudomonas syringii was everywhere on potatoes and on strawberries, and it was causing frost to occur at temperatures that would normally not have frost. And so they genetically engineered the bacterium so that it would be impotent and it would not align the water molecules and then refrigerate them. In other words, to protect the strawberry harvest and the potato harvest. So from an economic standpoint, it was a brilliant idea. Let's just spray something and then we will not have to worry about the temperatures and covering them, et cetera, et cetera. Well, our friend Andy Kimbrell was involved in the defense of nature here at one point, and an attorney went to the judge, and they pointed out that pigweed and other weeds also die with this frost. And if you eliminate the ability for this frost to kill it, they may survive and grow and become an invasive species. So what you're aiming at strawberries and potatoes may end up having a huge impact on the ecosystem. And then they had to incinerate the soil where they had released it. We now know that this Pseudomonas syringae is pushed up into the atmosphere above in California where I live, and
Wow.
it creates rain
Mm,
from the moist air blowing over. So if the impotent genetically engineered version had a survival advantage, we don't know,
hmm,
and it displaced the natural version, it could alter weather patterns
mm.
permanently and worldwide. So it's an example of how much we don't know. I mean, I remember interviewing a integrative uh, health expert, Dietrich Klinghardt, and he pointed out that about half the research on St. John's wort showed no problem, no effect, and half showed effect.
Huh.
And he said, if you look at how they did their research, it's possible that those that showed the effect had an intact microbiome from the plant.
Oh, no. Wow.
He said some of these herbal remedies, it may not be the quality of the herbs, but the microbiome that's attached to them. He said that
Wow.
when you eat salad, we actually only digest 5% of the nutrients of the roughage.
Oh, my Lord.
But
Wow.
nonetheless, they are healthy. So
Mhm.
maybe it's the microbiome on the leaves that's causing the issue. We know that
Wow.
we're bringing in genetic information, and we're babes in the woods in terms of really understanding what's going on. A few years ago, they realized that the RNA of plants can help
Mhm.
program DNA expression in humans. So it's like it's
Hmm.
not just vitamins and minerals and phytonutrients, it's also the RNA that can
Wow.
packages of knowledge, just like they said in ancient times that there's knowledge that's brought in the food. That's ancient Ayurveda talks about that.
Hmm.
Well, there is knowledge in the food in the form of specific RNA sequences. And if you genetically engineer, you can change those sequences. So
Mhm.
instead of programming something that you're not even looking for that could be healthy, now you may be programming something that's unhealthy that you're still not looking for. So you add that to the fact that they want to gene edit the food supply,
Yeah.
taken away the restrictions and the requirements in so many countries. And that's just one example of what might go wrong. But coming back to the microbes,
Yeah.
we know that the more we look, the more we are in awe of nature's majesty. We are humbled before the fact that there are microbes that are needed inside us to tell our gut walls to repair a particular cell because we don't
Mhm.
have the capacity. We don't have the monitoring device to do that. We have outsourced it to the microbes.
Mhm.
When if we have breast cancer, bacteria, certain type go into the breast to protect, to contain it. When we have, if there's Alzheimer's, certain fungus go up there to contain it. If we start
Mhm.
removing, according to Dietrich Klinghardt, start killing off the microbiome of the brain, the IQ goes down.
Mm.
Who is this micro Jedi army that we live with?
Yeah.
Why are we changing the nature of nature? Why are we
Mm.
allowing Bayer Monsanto, I like to call them,
Yeah.
to produce billions and quadrillions of microbes for release? There are 22 microbes that we know of that fix nitrogen, and it's creating its own new one. Now, I asked Kiran Krishnan, who's an expert at the human gut microbiome, what could go wrong? He says, well, when you release a microbe in the soil, you want to make sure it survives. And so you build in defenses. You build in the ability so it will not die, so it becomes antibiotic resistant. And then
Mm.
you want it to kill off others so it can produce antibiotics so that it dominates. So,
Mhm.
irrespective of what you put in the soil in terms of the nitrogen fixing or whatever, what
Right.
if that mechanism were to change to transfer to pathogens in the gut? Now you've equipped the pathogens in the gut with an ability for them to survive and kill off others. And it's like that was without even knowing about nitrogen fixing. What if it fixes nitrogen and transfers into algae in the Gulf?
Mm.
These dead zones are from the flow of nitrogen
Right.
fertilizer into the water. What if the microbes in the water themselves are starting to produce nitrogen, causing an overabundance of algae blooms, etc.? Figure that one out. There's so many other steps that we're not equipped to understand And the blinders that we get put on are like the people at Bayer Monsanto are basically not allowed to think outside those. I remember talking to a former Monsanto scientist. He said 3 of his colleagues at Monsanto tested the milk from cows treated with Monsanto's bovine growth hormone, found so much cancer promoting hormone in the milk, the 3 Monsanto scientists refused to drink milk thereafter unless it was organic. One bought his own cow. He said another set of scientists told him that when they fed genetically engineered corn to rats, the rats had serious health problems. So they redesigned the study, rewrote it to hide the effects. He said, the people in Southern Africa eat far more corn for far more time than those rats. And he was very concerned because the maximum amount of corn they feed for the rats in Monsanto studies is 33%. But it can be 50 or 70, and in times of famine, 90% of the caloric intake in Southern Africa can be corn. So when I found out that a farmer was feeding his workers the same corn, GMO corn, that he was feeding his cows and pigs, he didn't realize it, but they were dying and having serious health problems, both the animals and the workers. He didn't put it together, and a colleague who was a veterinarian from the United States told him, don't feed your animals any more GMO corn. So we switched to non-GMO corn, fed them the non-GMO corn, and the cows got better and the pigs got better. And lo and behold, all of a sudden, the inflammatory problems, the headaches, the flu-like symptoms from his workers, he had to keep 20% more workers on the farm because so many were sick. He had to keep 60 instead of the 50 that he needed. And he said, once or twice a month, he would speak to a worker and their eyes would actually move up in different directions. It wouldn't track properly. And he knew from experience that within 1 or 2 days, that person would be dead. He had no reason to explain why. No idea. But all those problems went away when he was feeding non-GMO corn to his cows and pigs, because it was also became the staple of the workers on the farm. So the people in Monsanto may hear about it, they may know about it, but they're trained not to look. And I remember speaking to one of the world's greatest biologists, P.M. Bhargava, in India. And he was assigned by the Supreme Court to look into the approval process for GMOs because of a citizen's petition. So he joined the approval committee for 9 months and then wrote a report to the Supreme Court and the Prime Minister and the Health Minister saying that no GMOs were properly evaluated anywhere in the world. There's 30 different categories that need to be looked at, and less than 10% are, and they've been done so badly by industry themselves, they're worthless. And I sat with him in his office and he said, this needs to be studied, and this needs to be studied, and this needs to be studied. And basically he gave the categories that I had written in my book, Genetic Roulette, which is behind me. And I had worked with over 30 scientists to create that list of all the known health dangers. You referred to it earlier. And I said, Dr. Bhargava, I've talked to scientists all over the world, and we've compiled individually. This person gave me these ideas. This person gave me these ideas. But here you are looking at and naming them all. How is it that you have this insight? He says, today, science is so tunnel vision. Everyone looks just at their area. But I've been doing this for so long, and I'm looking at big pictures like origin of life on Earth. 25 of my former students and colleagues have Nobel Prizes. We look at the big picture. So from that perspective, interdisciplinary biology, he could see that it was a disaster. But the individuals were tunnel vision, and they're tunnel vision both in their study and in what they think they can affect. So they may not drink milk anymore, but they may not think that they can affect Monsanto's marketing because they're just the scientists.
Let's talk about synthetic biology, because that's another place that genetically engineered microorganisms are used. Would you like to explain that process for our audience?
So synthetic biology has more than one definition. There's the Craig Venter version where he creates new versions altogether, like he'll take a cell, pull out the DNA, create the smallest possible amount of DNA for a living organism, put it into the DNA cell, replicate it, and now he's created completely an organism that never existed before. So that's one way of defining synthetic biology. But a more common version is to turn microbes into little factories. And so this was done in the 1980s by Showa KK, a big chemical company in Japan, where they took bacteria that was normally used in the production of L-tryptophan, and they put some more genes in there so that they could produce it more economically. So more steps would be done by the biology itself. And that process, I mean, genetic engineering, the most common result is surprise side effects. So there were contaminants in this L-tryptophan, 5 or 6 of them at very low levels. It still passed the US pharmaceutical standard for safety because it was 98.5% pure, but there were 0.1% and 0.01% levels of these contaminants that ended up to be deadly. It killed about 100 Americans and caused 5 to 10,000 to fall sick. And there was a whole cover up that I explain in my book, Seeds of Deception, and referred to also in Genetic Roulette. But this is one of the first examples of synthetic biology as we know it, turning bacteria into a factory. Another one was bovine growth hormone. That was the thing that was used to create the milk that the Monsanto farmers wouldn't drink. They inserted genes from cows into bacteria so that it would produce the hormone that's normally produced in the cows. Then they could concentrate it and make it at a fraction of the cost, which they then concentrated and injected into cows. And that's called crack for cows and has a terrible impact on the cow's health. And as we talked about, potential for producing high levels of IGF-1, which is linked to breast cancer and prostate cancer and other cancers. So now they're using it for food. Impossible Burger takes a gene from soybeans that normally produces a protein in the roots of the soy, Lego hemoglobin, and it's produced. It has a red look, so it looks like blood. It may have a taste like that reminds people of meat, and they put it into yeast. And instead of isolating just the Lego hemoglobin, they just scoop up whatever's created, a very stupid and dangerous technique, and they end up with 26 other uncharacterized proteins. That's 30% of this slurry, and put that in the food. So they take a protein that's never been in the human food supply that makes their nice red color, 26 other proteins that we have no idea what they'll do, that goes in there. And they happen to use genetically engineered soy sprayed with Roundup, and it's a disaster. And I say, friends, don't let friends eat the Impossible Burger. But so there's the unanticipated side effects. So there was genetically engineered yeast in the 90s where they put genes from yeast into yeast, expecting just an increase of a particular protein, and there was a 40 to 200 fold increase of a known carcinogen. And the people said, they wrote and said, this is really serious, and if you're going to genetically engineer yeast, you have to pay careful attention. Well, people at the Impossible Burger apparently are not paying attention to that. Highly dangerous. And we don't know what else is happening in their yeast. But these are examples. You have the problem with the unknown side effects. So is it exactly a protein that occurs in nature? Is it the right configuration? Because some of them have a different right-handed or left-handed configuration, which could be different, and that could be an effect. Is it purified perfectly? If it happens to be the exact same protein produced under careful conditions that's produced in nature, they have an argument for using synthetic biology where they will claim that it's safe. And I may not have an argument to fight against that particular thing, but they've used yeast or bacteria, right? You ask the Impossible Burger people, how do you dispose of it? We dispose of it according to the laws in the counties where we operate. Oh yeah, all counties are well equipped with the ability to completely destroy these microbes that are genetically engineered. Now, what if it's not 100% kill? What if they're producing massive amounts of genetically engineered yeast and bacteria, and it's ending up in streams and in the air and on people's hands. Now we have a source of genetically engineered microbes that can travel, mutate, swap genes, damage or collapse ecosystems, and cause human health catastrophes. So we have these two sides of the issue. We have what they're producing, which could be dangerous for the food supply to eat. And we've seen it in L-tryptophan. We've seen it in the other experience with the yeast. There's many other examples we don't have to go into. And then there's what do they do with their mother stock? What do they do with the genetically engineered microbes that they've applied synthetic biology to? Down the back end, it could be a disaster. And, like they want to use SynBio on algae to create fuel because algae can create like ethanol. Now, what happens if that algae escapes and then the same biofuel producing genes end up in algae, changing its ability to produce oxygen? Algae produces 70% of the world's oxygen. It's really the lungs of the planet, not the rainforests. What if we have reduced it by 5% or 10% or 90% because we've given a genetic combination that increases the survivability of the altered algae that displaces the natural that destroys the planet's oxygen supply? So these are examples of synthetic biology's unpredictable side effects that can come from someone walking on the plant and touching it and walking away and having it blown off their finger and becoming the seed of a cataclysm.
Yeah. Yeah. Alan Lewis at Natural Grocers did a reading of Ginkgo Bioworks, which is one of the Bayer-funded companies. He read their SEC filing, and that's their statement where they have to disclose the risks to investors. And straight from their SEC filing, Ginkgo Bioworks, it says, the release of genetically modified organisms or materials, whether inadvertent or purposeful, into uncontrolled environments could have unintended consequences. We cannot guarantee that these preventative measures will eliminate or reduce the risk of the domestic and global opportunities for the misuse or negligent use of our engineered cells, materials, and organisms and production processes. And then they go on to explain that because this is so unpredictable and out of their hands, they could even run afoul of laws that govern select agents. And select agents is the government euphemism for biological weapons. These are the pathogens that are ideal for biological weapons because they don't circulate normally and they're very deadly. And like that's, you can't make this stuff up. This is so far beyond what, I would have never gone out on a limb and said, hey, you know what? These microorganisms are so wily that they could turn into pathogens that are ideal for biological weapons. But this is the company itself disclosing that risk to its investors.
Yeah, I think I had heard part of that, but not the whole thing. Thank you. That was really great to hear. And it's interesting that in spite of that disclosure, they have full approval to continue.
Oh yeah.
And
Well,
it's
so
like,
what regulations are there? I mean, I don't know of any regulations that would control or restrict anything that they're doing with. I mean, they're just having vats of genetically engineered microorganisms producing synthetic proteins for the food supply, and it seems that there's nobody regulating this right now.
well, the EPA has as you know very well, but some of your listeners may not. There was an effort made by the biotech industry in the early 1990s to make sure that Congress was not involved in the regulation of GMOs. They wanted they didn't want any new laws to be created. They wanted the existing regulations that had been created for non-GMO agriculture, toxins, food, to somehow magically apply to GMOs, which have a totally different profile in terms of their danger. So they called it a regulated framework, and they asked the USDA, the EPA, and the FDA to regulate GMOs using existing laws. So the EPA took on and said, okay, we'll handle the microbes. So their microbe regulation is handled through laws and a division that focuses on toxic chemicals. Now, you have a toxic chemical spill, it diffuses over time. You have a GMO microbe that has a toxic effect, it changes and grows and propagates and it's unrecallable. They have like a 30 to 90-day review window where most questions are not answerable. They only look at microbes that are slated for commercial use. We analyzed it. We have a legislative report that we send out to members of Congress, and it's basically ridiculous. It's basically a facade that will not rein in even a tiny percentage of the toxicity, potential toxicity of microbes. Because all you just need to know is microbes travel, self-replicate, mutate, swap genes, and operate on a microbiome, which is fundamental to life on Earth. It's like, oh, we forgot those things. We're treating it like a chemical, and we're looking at chemical properties of it and ignoring the biological properties of it. It's basically ridiculous. So even though the government may say we have laws, and I mentioned earlier, what about the high school science class? Those microbes are not slated for commercial release, so they have no government oversight whatsoever. Even that little terrible piece of legislation that governs toxic chemicals does not apply if it's just designed as an experiment.
Wow. Well, Jeffrey, we've been talking for an hour. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface of this topic because it really is literally mind-blowing when you think about the ramifications this new technology. I mean, it's not even that new. This technology that's been out there that companies like Bayer and Monsanto have been playing with for years, totally unregulated. Yeah. So, Jeffrey, leave us with the most important next steps for people who are viewing us now. What should we do next?
Well, I want to add one thing before I pivot to that, and that is that gene editing is so cheap and easy. You can buy a do-it-yourself kit online for $169, even though it's very limited in what it can do. For $2,000, people can have their own labs and create virtually any type of microbe. Not any, but quite a bit of options. So we're in a situation where we have arrived at an inevitable time in human civilization where we can easily redirect the streams of evolution for all time, irreversibly, in ways that we can't predict. Now, this means that this new technology requires a new understanding, a new relationship with nature, certainly new laws, but it means that we have the capacity to destroy the nature of nature for all future generations. They can look at this generation as the one that cursed them, the one that they continually have to deal with, our folly in terms of destroying human health or ecosystem health. And it goes actually beyond just the microbes because they've deregulated gene editing. And we can do another interview on that if you'd like. We're having a new film, an animated film that's coming out in a few weeks on that, showing what actually happens in the DNA during gene editing. And now they're allowing companies to introduce gene-edited GMOs into the food supply and environment with no government awareness. So it's just like, it's the gold rush with the Wild West. There's no oversight whatsoever. So what this does is it sort of demands a comeuppance. Now, we've all had friends or know of people who had a serious health issue and even a determination that they may not live, that lived, but end up describing that prognosis as a blessing because it had a chance to rethink who they were, how they functioned, what they did in the world. And their whole life was redefined at that moment when they conquered their threatening prognosis by stepping up to a higher calling. I think that humanity is in that position right now. We've never been in this situation where an individual in science class could destroy it for everyone, where we have a new relationship with all living beings and all future generations, where we can destroy it. Now we must safeguard it. I remember hearing about a indigenous wise person through a friend of mine who heard it directly, that around this time we have the capacity to destroy biological evolution as we know it. And I think this is what it is. We have that capacity now, so we need to redefine ourselves as the protector, which is why we use the word protectnaturenow.com, because it's not just a catchphrase. It's an introduction to a new way for humanity to be in this world. And one thing we need to do is respect and love the microbiome and realize some of the things we talked about in terms of the breastfeeding, etc. These little guys are awesome. We need to love them, and we need to protect what we love. But it also extends to nature, to the intelligence of nature. So I see this as a threatening prognosis that if we go along the way we've been going, we may not make it. But this is the way that we can pivot as a collective consciousness. And I believe collective consciousness is the word. We have enough individuals becoming aware of it, operating as if it's true, and that changes. I think consciousness is non-local, non-linear, and that there are times in history where we do leap forward in our own version of leap. We leap forward from as a species and say, okay, this is now how we're going to define ourselves. So I'd say one of the antidotes for the old thinking is to take the blinders off. We've been trained in the way we've been educated, the way we relate to politicians and media, etc., to think it's not our responsibility, someone else will handle it, we're just over here. That is an epidemic of a disaster. We do have responsibility, we are related to everything, and we can make choices ourselves that will affect all things. And even if we don't spend, like I did 26 years working on GMOs, constantly, there's ways to support those of us who do, ways of taking information that your organization, your wonderful organization, OCA, puts out there, and Millions Against Monsanto puts out there and gets it out to the world. And Institute for Responsible Technology, be a conduit, learn what you can, share this information, contribute to the organizations, and we will also have deeper dive opportunities for people to become more educated, to become educated advocates, to organize locally, to organize internationally, to get information to your elected officials. So certainly sign up when you go to Protect Nature Now, join the list, and we'll keep you informed. Make sure you're also on the OCA's list. If you're not, you should be. They're an amazing organization. And there'll be opportunities as we unfold, but it's not like do this today and then forget about it. It's like, yeah, this is actually a new way of being human. And so it needs a practice. We're doing something different than we've done for hundreds or thousands of years. We're taking a new responsibility. And so this is something that we get to practice and share and master and pass on, along with the new laws, along with the new regulations, along with the greater corporate understanding. So it's a positive opportunity, because this change in the way we relate to ourselves in relationship to nature is needed not just in genetic engineering. It's needed in climate. It's needed in so many other things. So it's like if you continue to have that behavior that creates the disease, that creates the prognosis, sometimes the prognosis will be the blessing. So this is something that, because it's something that any individual can create the problem with a little gene editing kit, it's democratizing the gene pool in a way that's absolutely dangerous, unprecedentedly, existential threat. But it means that each individual now has a new responsibility, because we each have a unbelievable capacity to affect all living beings and all future generations. So we need to take that and say, okay, I'm on board. I'm taking charge. I can't necessarily devote my life to it. That doesn't matter. It's not an excuse to keep the blinders on. I'll do what I can, and I'm going to move forward with this movement.
Well, Jeffrey, I am so happy that you and I connected here today. With everyone who's listening and participating, thank you all for being with us. And I just can't wait to find out what's next for this collaboration. We support your work at protectnaturenow.com, and we look forward to the next opportunity. Thank you so much, Jeffrey.
Thank you so much, Alexis.